Oh, now we're recording. Okay, very good. Yeah, so I'm Stephen Barrow. I'm a social planner with Community Development Halton. In case we haven't met, yeah, there's some familiar faces and a lot of folks I haven't met. So very happy to meet you here, and thank you for joining us. It's as Risha said, we're kind of right at the end of the week and near the holidays, and it's snowing here. So I don't know if anybody has a fireplace where you are. I do, but it doesn't work. And so I've got the lovely fire channel in the background just to keep us a little cozier. Um, so anyway, we'll jump in. I'm just going to bring up my presentation. There we go. Okay. So, as Risha pointed out, actually just checking, does everybody see the presentation up? Is that what we're seeing?
Yeah,
Okay.
just not in presenting mode though. It's
Oh,
yeah.
it is on one screen, but not on the other. Okay. Um,
While Steven's doing that, we'd love it if people are comfortable just to pop into the chat where you're tuning in from. That would be lovely just to get a sense around where we're all coming in from. Wonderful. We've got Conservation Halton, Feed Halton, Town of Milton, Employment Halton. Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. Burlington Public Library, Center for Skills. The Milton Public Library. All right.
I love the response from from our conservation folks. This is really cool to have you here.
Yeah, welcome.
Yeah, amazing. And all of you. Yeah, Lee, always we're always glad to have you. Always, always, always. There we go, Stephen. You
there.
did it.
Awesome. There you
Aha.
go.
Two screens, figuring it out. Okay. Thanks everybody for your patience. Okay. Um, so yeah, welcome. We're here to talk about NEET Youth in Halton. So as we'll get into it a little bit, NEET Youth stands for youth that are not in employment, training, or education. And so another perhaps less statistical way of describing it would be youth who find themselves disconnected or deeply disconnected. Um, and Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about this demographic of youth and where they are in Halton, and perhaps explore some ways that we might come together as a community to try to keep our young people connected, or to help them be reconnected if they find themselves outside of a lot of opportunities in their early life. So I'll just start by grounding us in a land acknowledgement. So we'll start with acknowledging that Halton is rich in the history and modern traditions of Indigenous peoples. Halton specifically sits on the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, part of the Anishinaabe Nation that extends from the Niagara Peninsula across Hamilton, Halton, and Toronto to the Rouge River Valley. We thank the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Anishinaabe for sharing their traditional territory with us, and we recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous people on this land. And in this spirit, one of the teachings that our friends at Grandmother's Voice had shared with me a number of months ago that I really kind of continue to reflect on and ground myself in is the two-row wampum belt. So this represents both an agreement and a teaching between the Haudenosaunee and European settlers of North America. So here in this image, we see two parallel rows of purple beads on a bed of white. And this represents different peoples traveling side by side along the river of life, each following their own path and yet moving forward together. And this is done in mutual friendship, peace, and respect, while acknowledging that we share the same air, waters, and land that sustains us. Um, so this teaching, as we think about our disconnected young people specifically, and the lived experiences they may have had or are currently having, and really just the overall idea of belonging in our communities. That this teaching helps us reflect on how belonging is a shared effort, that it's cultivated through relationships, recognition, and reciprocity. So, as a dynamic and deeply human experience, belonging is interwoven in our unique and collective identities, histories, and cultures, and our visions for the future. Um, so, this applies to our immediate circles in our lives, our immediate relationships, to the regions within which we live, in our municipal communities or local communities, and across the globe. Um, so this is something that really grounds me in this conversation as we talk about our young people in our communities specifically. So yeah, I wanted to share that before we got started. So just a little bit about us and what we do. We always like to share. Yeah, Heather, I love the hearts. Yeah, this is feeling the love. Um, So I'll do a very quick pitch, but we have our two pillars at Community Development Halton of volunteer Halton and social planning. Um, we Together we strive to improve the quality of life for all residents in Halton, and we do this through combined research, community development, planning, and promoting volunteerism and civic engagement. So in this work, we identify the needs in the community, develop awareness around these trends and needs, and work to facilitate and support a community response, to advocate for systems change and to have those needs actioned upon. So in short, connecting the community is what we do. Um, a quick shout out to Volunteer Halton and some of the upcoming events in the new year as we look to 2026, and you can find this on our website as well. But we've got a combined volunteer engagement community of practice webinars, um, other webinars on creating robust postings for volunteers, volunteer connector information sessions. So if you haven't checked out Volunteer Connector, definitely recommend giving that a look. Again, you can find it on our website. Um, and each year we're involved with both a volunteer appreciation week event and a Halton nonprofit congress. And so volunteering and civic engagement are so core to the heart of what ties our community together and supports one another, how we support one another. And so um, the work of Heather and Karen and Volunteer Halton is really builds that capacity and keeps that going, keeps that spirit alive. Speaking of Volunteer Connector, if you want to take a moment to scan the QR, if this is something your organization or someone you know might be interested in, it is a great platform to connect folks to volunteer opportunities in the community. So if you'd like to find out more, please do check out this QR code and the subsequent link. Social planning. So these are a few of the things that I'm involved with. So we do combine social research that informs and supports the nonprofit sector, businesses, and government. We convene community. So some of our convening events um, are up here. So we have the National Right to Housing Day in November. Um, and we've also got we've been doing a year-long project with our friends at OKN and Header on sense of belonging in the community. We have our Voices of Lived Experience project, the Community Data Watch podcast series. So if anybody's interested in having a podcast conversation about NEET Youth and your work with these young folks in the community, please do reach out to us, and we would be happy to explore a podcast interview if that's something you'd be interested in. And a special thank you to our major supporter of the Community Data Watch work, which is United Way of Halton and Hamilton, um, and the municipality of Halton, as the regional municipality of Halton, for your continued support of this work. It's always a an adventure kind of to explore like what data is available and when, and how to kind of align this with upcoming needs in the community and what folks are wanting to learn more about. And so this support is huge, and it means that we're able to really provide this information in a timely manner. Um, I would also like to thank our peer reviewers for this paper. A shout out to Halton Black Voices, Halton Industry Education Council and Career Center, HMC Connections, Halton Newcomer Strategy, and the Canadian Caribbean Association of Halton and Stride. Thank you so much for your feedback and thoughts for this paper. And yeah, we've really appreciated the collaboration. Okay, so jumping into all things NEET Youth. So this paper, this report is this is sort of a tally of some of the major data and literary sources. So just to give you a sense of where you might find data on NEET Youth, both locally and regionally, provincially and nationally. So much of this is based on the census of population, which includes data from both 2016 and 2021. And that's because 2016 was when Statistics Canada and the census first started collecting information on NEET Youth. And on a bit of a personal note, my first sort of engagement with the topic of NEET Youth and working with youth in the community um, back in my days in Kingston, that began in 2016 and that was when people were really starting to talk about it. And um, a lot of the themes that we'll talk about in this presentation are themes that haven't gone anywhere. They were present in those early conversations in 2016, and they're still present now. And so it really speaks to some of those kind of entrenched systemic barriers that our young people face. So we've also based some of the employment data on the labor force survey, and then related articles from the following organizations and initiatives. So we really try to ground it in local context as well as in um, provincial context as well to draw comparisons. So this Community Data Watch report, in an absolute nutshell, explores the three main drivers of NEET status, which would be disconnection from education, employment, and training, or youth not being in the labor force. So we're going to look a little bit at how many NEET youth live in Halton across its municipalities and neighborhoods. This map that you see on the screen next to the text depicts and we can kind of look at it a little bit, depicts the concentrations of NEET youth across the region and where some of the kind of hot spots are that we might consider when doing planning to address their needs. So specifically we've got um, here in North Oakville, a higher concentration of NEET youth, as well as sort of dispersed between Oakville and Burlington and Milton specifically as well, with some folks in Halton Hills. But as we'll see as we go forward, the largest growth in NEET youth population, or the highest numbers of disconnected youth over time in recent years, has been Oakville and Milton specifically. Um, so, from a census standpoint, the populations of NEET youth aren't spread evenly across the region. So 75% of census tracts, for those who may not know, the census tracts are each of these kind of little squares in the map. And so 75% of those locales have fewer than 115 NEET or disconnected youth. North Oakville specifically has 415, so well above the census tract average. 44%, so or sorry, 44 census tracts, or about a third of all census tracts in Halton, had a higher than the regional average. So again, there's these sort of pockets of specific areas that require location-based interventions. And those specific priorities are the 14 tracts, or 10%, which exceed the regional average by 100%. That's a lot of numbers. I'm wondering if anybody has a quick question or two, just, if I can clarify this at all before we move on. If not, then we can continue. All good? Okay.
Well, Kieran says, do you have stats data that shows change over time?
Yes, between 2016 and 2021. So thank you for that question. Yeah, we will for sure address that. Yeah. So the core themes that you'll see throughout this presentation include ways that we can address gaps by shifting focus away from individual circumstances of youth and towards institutional and systemic change. But that systemic change really does need to be informed by young people themselves. And so even though we're learning what we can about the individual circumstances of young people and the drivers of disconnection, in our response, we're focusing on what that means at the systems level. We're going to cover overlapping disadvantages that rise steadily with age. So that's a major theme or change over time, to Karen's question. From the temporary transitions that we sometimes see in our young people between ages 15 and 24 as they age out of high school and into the labor market or post-secondary. But then into potentially longer term disadvantages for the older end of the NEET Youth spectrum, which is ages 25 to 29. There are distinct gender patterns that also change with age, so we'll look at that. Very importantly, many racialized youth are disproportionately impacted by NEET disconnection. We'll dive a bit more into that and the specific groups that are impacted in particular. And then, in terms of location-based intervention, Oakville and Milton are disproportionately impacted with higher populations of NEET youth. And so we'll be kind of addressing that in some of the strategies that take us forward. So here's a bit of a breakdown of NEET youth by municipality and also a comparison of Halton with other regions. So here we see on the right, Halton is actually overall doing quite well in terms of it has a lower than the provincial average of NEET youth. And even among its neighboring regions, we are on average, we have on average fewer disconnected youth proportionally to our population. But within Halton, we see that there are disparities. And so, and on the chart on the left, we have those municipal differences as well as the change over time between the number of NEET youth in 2016 and the number in 2021. And so, as we can see, that there's quite a large increase. And 2021 was sort of the closer to the end of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so one of the things we might discuss later might be the impacts of the pandemic on these rates. But it is important to note that youth unemployment rates remain relatively high in 2025. And so, some of the same, it'll be very interesting to see when the next census is released to see what, how these numbers have changed post pandemic. But it's the trend has been in a bit of a challenging direction where there's been exponential increases in disconnected youth. So yeah, the last thing I'll say about that is, to put it in perspective, from 2016 to 2021, in Halton, there was a 73% increase in the number of NEET youth. So again, it's definitely something, pandemic or not, it's something that deserves our attention for sure.
Stephen, there's a question in the chat. Lynn's asking, were you able to look at this based on income also?
We did not look at income. Um, yeah, that's a really interesting question because
Yeah, unfortunately, Richard's not able to be with us today, who did the data analysis just due to a conflict. I'm not sure that data is available for like this particular update, like at that level from a reliability perspective. But we can circle back to see if there's an update that we can provide for you when we're able to. It's a great question. Thanks.
yeah, I'm gonna take a note of that because often, yeah, Richard can often speak to, yeah, like I mean, Richard definitely gets the credit for writing the report and collecting the data, and he has a very keen eye for when new data is released, and so um, we'll definitely keep a note of that in case there is data that comes out that we could share out. Um, especially as we talk about employment rates, even though, young people might be employed, if it's part-time or if it's minimum wage, like it'd be below the poverty rate, below the poverty line, and so, or the market basket threshold. So, yeah, that intersection would be really important to look at. Um, but so here we have a breakdown of, so we've kind of talked about how NEET youth rates are different by region as well as by municipality within Halton specifically. Um, and also, here we have the differences in NEET youth rates based on age. And this is really critical to any response that we may have as a community. Um, so we see from here the youth that are ages 15 to 19, so primarily youth that would still be in secondary school. Um, they primarily are like fall into the unemployed and not in the labor force categories. And um, just to kind of share with you a distinction between those two, unemployed is refers to somebody who these are StatCan definitions for it. Unemployed refers to a person who is not working but is able to and actively looking for work, whereas not in the labor force would refer to someone who either for various reasons cannot work or is not looking for work actively. So they're kind of completely disconnected from the labor force. Um, and here, the highest percentage of youth from ages 15 to 19 are not in the labor force, and that's primarily because they're in secondary school. So they're not looking for work, or 65% are not looking for work um, because of that. And here we see that of the percentage of those not in school is quite low. It's at 8.6%. And so for this lower age group, they're primarily in school. If they're NEET youth, then um, they're mainly just not working. But then as we look towards the next age category of 20 to 24, um, we see a pretty big change. So this shift, there's more youth that are not in school, higher unemployment, which can indicate a struggle that youth are having in making the transition from school to employment. Um, and then we see a sharp increase in the overall triple NEET population. So this dark purple bar here. So that describes youth that are disconnected from all three um, factors or drivers. Um, and so as we move into the final age group of 25 to 29, um, we see some of the entrenchment happening of, the longer folks remain disconnected, like the more entrenched they become. So we see um, the impacts of these deeper patterns showing up in 59% of these youth not being in school, a relatively high um, overall NEET Youth rate, that dark purple bar on the right. So this is significant because even though, um, on the far left, we see the two green bars of unemployed and not in the labor force fairly low compared to the other two age groups. Um, the numbers of youth that are completely disconnected. So if they were already disconnected from school or work in the earlier ages, um, they're much more likely to be fully disconnected by 25 to 29. And so that's why we see these purple bars being so high. And therein lies kind of one of the more significant challenges for us as a community, which is, how do we reach these young folks that have been disconnected for some time from school and employment or training, um, and if they're disconnected from all three, then what factors are contributing to that, and how do we reach them? How do we know who it is that's struggling? Um, so very important pattern there. And here we look at a bit of a gendered lens here. So, um, as we just mentioned, like there's a rise in NEET prevalence, so those purple bars, as we go into mid to late 20s, um, and further entrenching that disconnection. And the gender pattern is pretty important to consider because for boys and men in the younger age groups tended to have a slower labor market integration or higher rates of being unemployed after secondary school. Um, and that levels out as they get into their mid to late 20s. For girls and women, the rates of NEET disconnection are become much, much higher in the late 20s. Um, and in the research that we've done, this was often linked to family care roles, mainly because kind of acknowledging in Canadian society, so there are still prescribed gender roles that can happen, and people that when it comes to childcare, girls and women taking the bigger bearing of that responsibility often, and so it can impact people in their capacity um, to stay connected or to be engaged in education or employment. Um, and we also, came across discussions of career breaks and then re-entering employment. So, um, particularly with having families, starting families, but also, maybe going to post-secondary and graduating, and then having a major gap in trying to find a job afterwards. And one of the major barriers that came up in the data around that piece specifically was that um, the longer a person is unemployed, the harder it is to get reemployed, because jobs often ask, why is there this gap, or why, um, what's going on there. And so um, I guess it really speaks to like the longer a person remains out of education or employment, the more difficult it is to re-enter. So racialized youth, this is another really important metric because on the map to the right we see um, similar patterns reflected among racialized youth, to the overall youth population, particularly around, the higher concentrations of young people in North Oakville and in Milton. Um, but racialized youth overall are disproportionately impacted by this disconnection. And we'll get in and we'll talk about the barriers that came up in the data as we go. Um, but more than half of Halton's census tracts reported proportions of racialized NEET youth that were below the regional average, while another 49 census tracts had rates 1 to 2 times higher, with eight census tracts recording rates 2 to 3 times the regional average. And so again, we see the need for this really targeted, culturally aware um, intervention, or strategy at the community level, or at the neighborhood level, because the rates of disconnected youth are very concentrated in certain pockets. Um, and racial I, the explanation in the data that came out was that racialized youth may often face discrimination in the labor market. So that um, cultural, religious, ethnic discrimination, um, unequal educational outcomes, partially due as well to those barriers that the youngest folks might face in the education system, and limited access to culturally relevant supports. So this can include language or community based organizations that could foster that sense of belonging. And among racialized youth specifically, some folks are impacted greater than others. So this graph here on the left depicts the overall or the share of overall racialized youth and that of racialized NEET youth status. So the figures with the green bars indicate an overrepresentation of racialized NEET youth among the total population of racialized youth, while the blue bars indicate the underrepresentation relative to the total racialized youth population. So, for example, Black youth in particular account for 13% of racialized NEET youth, um, compared to only being 11% of the total racialized population. So that difference of 2 percentage points represents an overrepresentation among Halton's NEET youth on the part of Black youth. Similarly, Arab youth are deeply impacted at a rate of 1.9% higher than the average. So very similar to the experience of Halton's Black youth. West Asian youth as well at 2 percentage points. But then we look at underrepresented groups that are perhaps faring a bit better than their neighbors. Chinese youth accounting for 9% of the NEET population and 12.7% of the racialized youth population, but accounting for 3.7% below the average. So Chinese youth are less represented in the NEET population among racialized groups. And similarly, South Asian youth, which represent the largest racialized group in Halton, are also at below the average of NEET youth for the total group. Is there any questions about that? That's also a very data-heavy slide. Okay. So community response. There's a lot that we're all already doing collectively that that's chipping away at this disconnection. Um, so, going back to this map of where NEET youth are in Halton, one of the conversations we might have today could be, are there local organizations that we're aware of in some of these, high impact areas that are supporting youth, whose stories that we could spotlight or share. Specifically, we've looked at the Halton Youth Collective Impact Initiative, YMCA, and their employment services programs, Halton Multicultural Council's youth employment programs, local school boards doing really important work. Um, and some of the major opportunities for that community response that can really help reconnect our youth could include job readiness workshops, mentorship programs, skills training, mental health supports, and culturally responsive services, particularly for racialized and newcomer youth. Um, and I may also add in there, wraparound family supports too, because youth don't exist in a vacuum, and so having those wraparound supports, which a lot of programs provide, offers a chance to support youth in multiple areas of their lives. Now, there are key challenges to these community responses. So I mean, as we mentioned before, like many service providers report that the most vulnerable NEET youth, or the most entrenched in that disconnection, in that latter population group of 25 to 29, are often the hardest to reach, um, based, in part because of the physical disconnection that exists, but also due to the stigma of, going without employment for some time or not being registered in school after secondary. The mental health challenges that folks develop when they're impacted by that disconnection, or caregiving responsibilities, as we mentioned earlier. Um, but other barriers that were identified that may also speak to these kind of regional or these local differences across the region include access to transportation, especially in rural areas, the racial discrimination that people experience when trying to access employment. Um, this can also include credential recognition for newcomers. So if folks have a degree or a professional credential, and they want to work in their field when they come to Canada. Um, if those credentials aren't recognized, it can create a significant barrier. But it needs to be mentioned too that the shortage of affordable housing and affordable childcare has a deep impact. Um, and also, this came out in uh, the Toronto article that we've cited earlier, but um, it's really important for our young people, to our young people, that the roles and the studies that they partake in align with their passions and values. And so perhaps one of the opportunities for us as a community would be to explore that with our youth and to try to, you know, be connectors between what their passions and values are with opportunities that would align. Um, and then lastly, but not least, postal code discrimination. So looking at folks that may be from economically disadvantaged areas that experience stigma and discrimination when they try to get a job, especially in some sectors. So, um, yeah, and if there are more barriers that anybody's sort of aware of that they'd like to share, we can definitely get into that in our discussion. So, in conclusion, the core themes that our report looks at, particularly in terms of barriers, you know, include that the main takeaways are that the number of youths that are disconnected from work, school, and training has grown sharply since 2016. And again, it may very well be continuing to grow. We'll have to see what the next census tells us, um, but this indicates a trend in that direction. Um, and these rates rise steeply with age, with men struggling most in the early years, while women facing lasting disconnection later in their 20s. Racialized youth, particularly Black, Arab, and West Asian communities, are disproportionately impacted. Geographically, Oakville and Milton face higher concentrations of NEET youth, and the data suggests a presence of systemic barriers that require focused and place-based interventions of support. Um, so some calls to action may include learning from the voices of NEET youth directly. And there's lots of ways we could explore that, what that could look like. Sustaining and expanding community programs. So particularly those that are working well and that youth feel comfortable accessing and grow from. Um, Improving system level collaboration, which um, examples like us here today spending an hour of our Friday really focusing on the needs of NEET youth is a really solid foundation to that. And then together we might address systemic inequalities or inequities. So looking at things from more of a systems level based on what the needs of the individuals look like. Um, this could look like tailoring interventions by age, engaging employers as partners, and advocacy based on all of the above. So I'm just wondering if this is an invitation, if we could maybe reflect on these three kind of core questions, or just generally, what story does the data on NEET Youth tell us? And what might we do as a community to better understand their needs and how we can take actions to take us forward. Um, and it might be because of the number of folks we have on the call today. Um, it might be helpful to break out into small groups, but I'll stay behind and chat with anybody that maybe doesn't want to be in a small group, or if you'd like to take a little bit of a break, you're most welcome to. But
I,
if you are
I
comfortable, please do jump in.